start at the beginning and simply kindly tell us who you are and what you do.
All right, so my name is Joost Hilterman, and I work for the International Crisis Group. This is an international conflict prevention organization. We seek to prevent the outbreak, the continuation and the recurrence of deadly conflict through the kind of work that we do. And of course, we are not the only organization in the field. There are many others, and we need to work together with them in order to accomplish as large a task as the prevention of armed conflict. Not any single non-governmental organization, certainly not one that runs on a budget of $20 million a year, could accomplish this. But together we can actually accomplish quite a lot. And there's a division of labor. So what we do, and in the presentation today I referred to this, there was a Chinese military commander from 500 BC called Sun Tzu. He was a military thinker. And what we learned from him and what he had learned from his own practice in the battlefield is that battles are won before they are fought. And how is that? By choosing the terrain in which these battles are fought. You can already prejudge the outcome in a way. At least that was his theory, and I think, again, based on practice. For us, if we have a battle, and our battle is actually to prevent conflict, that is our own NGO battle, how do you do it? And I think for us it is to frame the narrative. Because what we find in armed conflict is that the various actors all have their own narratives. They're all very self-serving narratives. They reflect their national psychologies. They're very selective, of course. And they're invariably aimed at supporting the defeat of the enemy, frankly. And of course, that is not what we aspire to. We want conflicts to end. So we look at these narratives, we compare them, we put them together, we try to find middle ground and to say, this is a narrative, a new narrative that supersedes these selective partisan narratives and that can help us in framing the debate in such a way that we can come to a peaceful conclusion to this conflict. Of course, it is not only the narrative that in the end will determine it, it's also resources, it is outside parties that may come in, there are all kinds of factors. In the end, it is what it requires is sort of an exhaustion, I think, on the part of warring parties, but also what I would call critical mass in terms of bringing pressure to bear on the belligerents to bring a conflict to an end. And so then we talk about who else is there. There's the mediation organizations that play roles in the United Nations. There are very powerful governments that can weigh in, sometimes destructively, but often also in a very constructive way. And we need to mobilize the key actors within these powers, these governments and within organizations in order to convince them that this is the way to resolve a conflict. And you can look at examples and see how bureaucracies, and these are often large bureaucracies where you really don't have political will, how you can move them over time from a position of sort of neglect or even support of an armed conflict to actively seeking to bring it to an end.
Thank you. And if you could give us some examples of where you've been and the kind of work that you've done there most recently.
Well, until now I have more of an operational role within my organization, but until not so long ago I worked mostly on the Middle East and North Africa, especially on Iraq. And of course Iraq now is very much in the news because of what is happening with the blitzkrieg perpetrated by the Islamic, what is known as the Islam, who call themselves the Islamic State. And so we have a very acute conflict situation. We have an ungoverned space that actually now is being governed de facto by a very radical and unpredictable actor that is operating not only in Iraq but also in Syria and is controlling really a large swath of territory. And we have to deal with that and have to find a way to address this. And of course, if you read the media and if you pay any attention, you see that there's a lot of calls for military action. Of course, first for humanitarian reason to save vulnerable populations who have been targeted by this group, and this is very serious. But also in order to defeat it, because in the end, there's a sense that this group could pose a serious threat to Western interests. And I think if we are going to pursue a strictly military response, we're going to fail. It's not going to work. Because this group may be a radical and extremist group with, that decapitates people and imposes very harsh restrictions on people. But they have been very smart, because they have worked very closely together in the areas that they have conquered in a very quick way they've worked closely together with the local population and with local political groups that themselves were disenfranchised and marginalized by the central government in Iraq, for example. And so in order to, if you go after this group militarily, you will unify that whole population in support of that group. But if you address the actually legitimate grievances of this population and their political representatives who've been marginalized and try to bring them back in to the political process in Baghdad, the capital, you can actually wean them away from these very extreme people. And I don't say that only because that's sort of wishful thinking, because this is actually what happened before. In 2006, there's a very powerful precedent when the same group, then known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, was also lording it over the local population and resorting to rather extreme measures. And they were booted out by the local tribes with American help, military help at the time, and it was very effective. The quid pro quo was that these local groups were then brought into the government in Baghdad. The tragedy is that Baghdad in the end didn't continue that process, then marginalized these groups again, and so then when the Islamic State came back a few months ago, they had a very fertile terrain on which to operate.